for everyone. The session The session is being recorded and will be uploaded in the YouTube channel named Department of English and Humanities ULAB. For convenience, it is requested to keep microphone muted when the session goes on. There is a designated question answer session which is at the end of the lecture. Do contribute with your comments and questions at that time. In case questions and comments are urgent, please do share using the chat features. As we know, we had our first forum in the last Monday, facilitated by Sudip Chakraborty, an associate professor of South Asian Studies. It was an intense discussion where we got overarching ideas how geopolitical issues shaping individuals as well as the world around them in different ways. There was discussion on how technology is currently molding the intricate dynamics of geopolitics in the contemporary world. The discussion also showed how different scholars and writers position themselves to show the influence of geopolitics through their different intellectual works. In the discussion, it was also emphasized the potentials of poems, short stories, translation works to humanize individuals entrenched in conflict zones and how such non-fictions can serve as a tool for raising awareness. In a nutshell, the first forum offered an overview of the intersection between language, literature, technology, and geopolitics. To dive deeper into navigating geopolitical realities, the role of language and literature, today we have Professor Kaiser Hamidul Hoxha, Dean School of Arts and Humanities. He skillfully weaves words as a poet, bridges cultures through translation, enlightens mind as an educator, and most importantly, a freedom fighter who brought independence for us. On behalf of the department, it is my honor to invite Professor Kaiser Hamidul Hoxha to deliver a insightful lecture for the faculty members and students. Please, sir.
Thank you very much, Dilani, for a very kind and generous and formal introduction. My little talk will be informal. Why? Because my engagement with geopolitics is informal. In fact, geopolitics was just a word whose meaning I knew from the use of common sense when it struck me that it was vastly important even in matters of culture and literature and the arts. Now, definitions have been given. Um, it suffices if we just look at the word itself, geo, which means world, and politics. Geo is related to geography, space, land, territory, oceans. And geopolitics has to do with the projection of power on the earth, on the geo. So it is not surprising that the word came into use fairly recently in modern times, because it is after the coming of colonialism that we could form a conception of a geo, a world that you can take in your hands and look at. So the theorizing about geopolitics also began when colonialism was at its height. It also has a prehistory because even in the earlier centuries, as European powers clashed, there were theories about politics, the politics of power play between nations. Now, geopolitics as a discipline, I think it began at the end of the 19th century, around 1880. And by the early 20th century, it was quite clear that ideas about world politics, the projection of power into territories, was something that exercised the minds not only of those involved in politics but also thinkers. Um, Two figures should be remembered. There was an American called Admiral Mahan, Mahan, who propounded the so-called sea power theory of geopolitics, that whoever controls the oceans controls the world. And you can imagine that this idea was perhaps inspired by the history of the British Empire. How could a remote island in the North Atlantic become the world's greatest superpower, the great and create the greatest empire in history? Because it had the strongest navy. And when this admiral propounded this theory, he was also thinking of America, following in Britain's footsteps and becoming a great sea power. Which reminds me of a joke I heard not long ago. The an American Navy flotilla was sailing by, and it crossed a Royal British Navy flotilla going in the opposite direction. The American commander um, radioed a message to the British commander of the British flotilla. What does it feel like to be the second biggest navy in the world? And the British commander radioed back, you tell me what it feels like to be the second best navy in the world. So you see, the British prided themselves on their navy. The Americans now pride themselves on their navy. And in fact, if you think of the balance of power in global politics, the naval power plays a very important role. An Englishman who was an academic and politician, he was a member of parliament and also an Oxford Don, called Sir Halford Mackinder. He then came up with the theory, or in a paper which he titled the geographical pivot of history. He argued that whoever controls the heartland will eventually control the world island. The world island comprises Europe, Asia, Africa. And the great heartland is Eurasia. Whoever controls Eurasia will control the world. So this is about land power, two opposed views. And subsequently, of course, there were theories which emphasized the importance of air power. Now, these theories are still relevant. In fact, Sir Halford Mackinder is regarded by many to be the father of geopolitics. And this is about big power politics. So this is something we have to keep in mind when we talk about geopolitics. We are not just talking about political power and political parties, etc. We are talking about the big powers of the world. And the reason why I suggested this topic is that sometime back it struck me that geopolitics is probably the most powerful force affecting our lives, every aspect of our life, including culture, literature, and the arts. I didn't do any research. I started thinking about it, you see, and it struck me that information I had picked up over the years supported this view. Let me give you some illustrations. When the Cold War was going on, the world was a bipolar world. Geopolitics meant the balance of power between the Soviet bloc and the free world led by America. Okay. The America launched a magazine called Encounter. It was it was a quality magazine. It dealt with literature, ideas, culture, and it was found out that it was financed by the CIA. When this was discovered, Stephen Spender, the poet, the British poet, he resigned from the editorship, and others took over. Okay, now this magazine, which we grew up with, Encounter was something we read regularly. It was there in every library. It was there in the British Council. When the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1990, in 1991, Encounter folded. It stopped publication. So to me, this is clear proof that Encounter was part of the cultural um, sort of war efforts, let's say, cultural war efforts of the free world against the Soviet Union. Again, on the other side, we grew up with the activities of the so-called Afro-Asian Writers Forum or something like that, or Afro-Asian Writers Society. I don't know if anyone here remembers that. I'm talking about the late 50s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. The Afro-Asian Writers Society was backed by the Soviet Union. Okay. And there were publications, there were conferences, writers and academics went to those conferences. So depending on one's ideological bent, many went to both. You see? So on the American side, you had, if I remember rightly, the Fulbright Awards, for example. Now, I think Senator Fulbright launched this project by using a portion of the money gained from arms sales or something like that. So it was military money, you see, which was funneled into this cultural activity. Now, at the same time, the Americans set up an American Studies Research Center in Hyderabad, which is still there, but it is no longer funded by America. In fact, a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed, American funding was withdrawn, and now it's looked after by the Indian authorities, with the result that it no longer has as rich a library as it used to have, because they can't afford to subscribe to all the journals. Now, how is this related to geopolitics? You see, because of the presence of the American ASRC, American Studies Research Center, the second or third largest outside outside North America. All the research degrees, most of the research degrees in the humanities and social sciences in India were on American literature or American studies. So this is how a sort of cultural influence is spread. Okay, it's perfectly legitimate. The Russians were giving away magazines, journals, books. You see, Progress publishers in Moscow put out many titles which were sold, which were dirt cheap here. Many of you, I'm sure many of you here, among those who are not so young, will remember reading the Progress publishers' titles. You see. There are many kinds of books, including world classics, not just Russian classics. Now, things like this made me realize that geopolitics was not something confined only to political activity, to global power play. It affected culture as well. Another interesting example, in the abstract art in the 1960s and 70s was promoted by the CIA. Okay. This has been revealed. Why? Because it shows that the free world, supported by of which America was the leading country, the free world allows all kinds of creative expression. By contrast, in the Soviet Union, all art had to be socialist realist. You know, so you have the same boring images of workers and revolutionaries and whatnot. See? Tractors in the fields, etc. So this was part of the culture war that went on while the Cold War was there in the world. Okay. Now, the Cold War ended, but it is not the end of geopolitics. When the Cold War ended, um, Francis Fukuyama proclaimed that history had ended. You know, his famous thesis that we are witnessing the end of history. Why? Because liberal democratic ideals had triumphed against totalitarian ideologies. Fascism was defeated in the Second World War. Communism was defeated because the Soviet Union collapsed. And now the whole world would become liberal democratic. Liberal democracy would become universal. And so there wouldn't be any more history, because history is the story of conflicting ideologies and powers. But has history ended? It has not. And in fact, we find that now there is talk of multipolarity. And this is again something geopolitical. The unipolar moment, which is the time when America was the only superpower, that, according to the multipolarists, is history. And now a number of other powers are coming up, and they are setting up their own poles. And BRICS has been described as the first step in the institutionalization of multipolarity. Now, this is the situation we are in now. And it affects culture broadly. It affects gender, because gender is one of the areas in which ideas about the nature of civilization are played out. So recently, I mean, in the West, there's a tremendous controversy going on about gender ideology and transgender rights, the identity of different transgender for people, etc., etc. Not only that, it has now reached a point where, and this is something that is being seriously and acrimoniously and passionately debated in the West. A child is free to choose what the child's gender will be. So there is a pushback, and then I think in most countries now they say that one has to at least 18 before one decides. But there are also instances of children in their mid-teens being, given the treatment to transition, as to say. Okay. And how is this related to geopolitics, you see, and to ideology? Now, according to some, this is an extreme example of the individualism on which liberal ideology is founded. This individualism, pushed to an extreme, has resulted in this, in giving everyone the freedom to choose their gender. So gender is no longer something that you are born into. It is something, it's a matter of choice. And this is this has created a dividing line within Western countries, because there's a pushback from within also, and between countries as well. So you have Russia, China, the Islamic world, on one side here. So I mean, you see how interestingly these strange dividing lines are drawn, and the unit that comes into play here is not an individual nation state, but a civilization. So this is another new concept which has come up, the civilizational state. A Chinese intellectual, Zhang Weiwei, Weiwei, Zhang is Zhang. He published a bestseller titled China, the Rise of a Civilizational State. And now in Russia, there are intellectuals who are calling Russia a civilizational state. By extension, they also think that, well, India is a civilizational state, because these are not the simple nation states. And so the large units that come into play in geopolitics are these civilizations. Now, there's a Russian philosopher who is, of course, sanctioned in the West, things Russian are being sanctioned, called Alexander Dugin. He has been called Putin's brain, or Putin's Rasputin. So just look him up, you can see that these ideas are, being developed. And to him, you see, like Huntington, he thinks that there are civilizations which can clash, and that today the collective West is facing a challenge from those who think that there should be multipolarity in the world. So you have the Russian civilizational state, the Chinese civilizational state, the Indian civilizational state, the Islamic world, Africa, Latin America. Okay. Now, I'm just giving you a broad picture. I'm not telling you. I'm not at all normative. I think what geopolitics should teach us is to look at what is happening in the world with a clear vision and critically. Because when we think of this view of civilizations being, the big players on the geopolitical scene, it struck me, what about the small countries like Bangladesh? We are not a civilizational state, and most countries in the world are small countries. Now, those who think in terms of big power politics have no time for small countries. One great geopolitical theorist today is a professor at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer. He has become a global celebrity after the start of the Ukraine war. Why? Because from 2014, he has been predicting that there would be trouble in Ukraine. And he blames the West and NATO for the war that is going on. So he is still very active. There were people who demanded that he should be cancelled, this new cancel culture is another aspect of the geopolitical situation today, you know. But he has not been affected. And interestingly, one of his most recent videos, you can just Google it, is a short 7-8 minute video on Julian Assange, and that is also related to geopolitics. In that video, he appeals to the British High Court not to deport Julian Assange, and he gives his arguments. Well, who is Julian Assange? He's a journalist who set up WikiLeaks. He did not leak anything. He was given leaked materials by others. Chelsea Manning, an American official, gave him the what became a the so-called a big a cache of documents, which were all top secret. So these revealed the way global power play works, and so the Americans want him to be extradited so that he can face trial. Now, Professor Mearsheimer's argument is that Julian Assange did not himself do any of the leaking. He was not an official. He's a journalist, and journalists have always used leaked information if they think that it is important and reveals something significant about the world. Before Assange, there's the case of the Pentagon Papers by a man called Ellsworth, I think, who died recently. He was an US official who leaked the documents about America's role in the Vietnam War when Lyndon Johnson was president. So, in other words, he leaked all the dirty secrets. Now, Professor Mearsheimer argues that the leakage of a state's dirty secrets is something that we should be grateful for, because these things inform us about the the undesirable things going on behind our backs. Okay, so this is also part of geopolitics. Now, how does all this relate to our lives? I mean, Mearsheimer was asked by a German journalist when he had explained his theory of big power politics. He believes in balance of power diplomacy. The big powers should exist in a state of balance, in which case you'll have peace. He also thinks that history, he belongs to the so-called realist school of geopolitics, that history is a struggle, and that the world, if you look at it from a geopolitical angle, is anarchic, and there are these big powers who try to impose their power, their authority over large parts of the globe. When one power is dominant, another will try to rise and challenge it. Okay, and he believes that the rise of another power is never peaceful. So he thinks that America's real enemy is China, and instead of getting into a dispute with Russia, America should focus on China. This was also behind the dialogue between Tucker Carlson and Putin, which was discussed in the first session last week. I saw a recording, even though I could not be present. At one point, Tucker Carlson says to Putin, I mean, don't you see that there's a risk that a new rising power will control you, and it will not be very it won't be a very pleasant thing. In other words, beware of China. And then Putin laughed and he said, "Oh, this is the old boogeyman story," you see. And he just laughed it off. Now, what was going on there? Tucker Carlson is a pro-Trump Republican, and to Trump, who is supposed to have been friendly with Russia, being friendly with Russia is okay, but China is the real enemy. You see, so how all this will play out, I don't know. Now, anyway, to go back to Mearsheimer's interview with the German journalist, he was asked, okay, sir, you have explained the way big power politics works, how big powers are balanced against each other, and when there is a right balance, the world is in peace. What about the small countries of the world? Without batting an eyelid, Professor Mearsheimer said, well, the small countries have to suck up to the big powers. Okay. This is brutally realistic. And if you think of our situation, you can relate this idea very easily. Now, in such a situation, what can writers do? What can artists do? I think, many writers and artists unwittingly somehow fall into one camp or the other, even when they think they are being independent. And I think, in extreme situations, some forms of dissent are encouraged and others are brutally suppressed. This is the harsh reality of the world. Now, when we think about applying our insights into geopolitics to the study of literature, how can you go about it? I think if we look at the history of literature, we will find the entanglement of big power politics and literature down the centuries. Sudeep touched upon this briefly when he mentioned Troy and the Ramayana. I'm teaching the Mahabharata to those taking English 4111. If you look at the Mahabharata, what do you find? The spread of Aryan civilization in northern India. So Aryavarta expands to cover the entire northern part of the subcontinent. There are non-Aryan people who are the enemies of the Aryans, and that conflict is dealt with quite vividly. The opening scene of the Mahabharata is this so-called Sarpa Satra, the snake sacrifice. And the Indian poet Arun Kolatkar has a whole collection titled Sarpa Satra, in which the snakes are none other than the underclass, the non-Aryan underclass. The conflict between the Aryans and those who were the indigenes here is also played out in the most famous folk epic of Bengal, the story of Manosha and Lukinda. So if you read my book, The Triumph of the Snake Goddess, you will get a vivid picture of how Aryan civilization spread and the conflict with non-Aryan elements and how then eventually a kind of compromise was reached. Um, Sudeep has mentioned the Ramayana, which is Aryan power going south all the way to Sri Lanka. He mentioned Troy. Coming down the centuries, if you look at Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra, it's about Europe meeting the East, because Cleopatra is portrayed as an Eastern queen. And the civilization in Egypt, which he uh, rules, is very different from what was taking shape in Rome. So there is a conflict, there's a clash of civilizations there in Antony and Cleopatra. Think of what happened in history when Alexander marched eastwards. His tutor, Aristotle, was very gung ho and sort of urged him to go. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, to go and get those barbarians. Now, who is a barbarian? A barbarian is somebody who does not belong to your society. Um, so, racism is born out of geopolitics. In with the rise of colonialism, which actually coincides with the rise of modernity, you also have racism, slavery as we know it in the Western Hemisphere, which is very different from slavery as it existed in this part of the world. We see the rise of pseudosciences like phrenology, physiognomy, and theories of geopolitics, which were aimed to give politicians some idea on how to hang on to power. Now, I made a list of the courses which are being offered in summer, and I thought, well, a lot of them can have elements which can be related to geopolitics. Bangladeshi writing in English and in English translation. Um, the think of Qazi Anis Ahmed's story, uh, Good Night, Dr. Kissinger. That's geopolitics for you. Think of Zia Haider Rahman's In the Light of What We Know. It's all about geopolitics. This character, this Sylheti boy who grows up in London, goes to Oxford as a scholarship boy, then becomes a Wall Street banker, then becomes a human rights lawyer. He comes to Bangladesh, he goes to Afghanistan, which is under American occupation, you see, and he has a breakdown. So the novel goes all over the world. And it's a world that is penetrated by power. There's a course on South Asian literature. South Asian literature has plenty to be related to geopolitics. In Bangladeshi writing, there's a little known novel which I would recommend to everyone, The Ugly Asian by Syed Waliullah, which has been published posthumously by Bangla Academy. Uh, 2 pages are missing because somehow 2 pages were lost, but you can still make sense of what it's about. The title of the novel is a play on another novel on similar themes, The Ugly American, which was also made into a film. So those doing cinema and literature will find a lot of things to write about in connection with in connection to geopolitics. You have The Ugly American, the Ugly Asian. You can see the Cold War politics at play. Think of Graham Greene's The Quiet American, a novel which has also been made into a film. There's a whole genre which emerged during the Cold War, the spy thriller. The spy thriller goes back to the early 20th century when you had Britain facing resurgent Germany, where writers like John Buchan, you see, the author of the 39 Steps and others. So there were spy thrillers even in the early 20th century. With the Cold War, you have James Bond, a whole series of novels which are still so delicious to read, and which still inspire film versions. Ever new film versions come out every now and then. So all the James Bond novels, the other writers of thrillers, you see, John le Carre, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, you see, a whole lot of them. This whole entire genre is steeped in the geopolitics of the Cold War. I think after that, after the Cold War ended, there have been attempts to find new subjects for thrillers, but I think nothing will ever match the Cold War as a backdrop for the spy thriller, though that was the golden period of the spy thriller. And that's absolutely, all about geopolitics. Post-colonial literature and theory. Now, post-colonialism is entirely steeped in the geopolitics of the colonial era. So you have Conrad, you have the even Midnight's Children is about the post-colonial era ending. All the novels set in the colonial times. Kipling's Kim, interestingly, you see. Kim is a novel that everyone should read because it's about the so-called great game between the Russians and the British. So the suspicion that Russia was trying to expand goes back to the colonial times. And it's all about espionage and how spies are trained. So it's a must. Those who are doing post-colonial literature and theory would do something on Kim and geopolitics, the geopolitics of the colonial era. Postmodernism in literature. Now, postmodernism as in literature and the arts emerged during the Cold War. This is the first wave of postmodernism. After the rise of literary theory, we have a second wave of postmodernism. But the great postmodern literary classics belong to the earlier phase. In the second phase of postmodernism, we have more theory than art and literature. In the first phase of postmodernism, you have, say, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse Five, which is about this is set in the Second World War. Um, you have Catch 22. You have Norman Mailer's the Naked and the Dead. So this also comes under American literature too. Modernism in literature is entirely emerged entirely in the shadow of the geopolitics of the early 20th century. The First World War was mentioned. Well, the First World War was the apocalypse that everyone was waiting for. You see, while as geopolitics emerged in the 1880s, this political thinking began then in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. At the same time, you have the rise of Germany and the threat to the British Empire, which then led to the First World War. While these tensions were brewing, the tensions have a long history. The tension of the rise of a sense of crisis in Western culture. This went on over more than a century. It had an intellectual side with the rise of science, like Darwin's theory of evolution. You had geologists who proved that the Earth is millions of years old and not 8,000 years old as the church taught. And then you have poets like Matthew Arnold writing in Dover Beach that the world is a world of chaos and anarchy, and only if the speaker and his beloved are true to each other can they find some meaning in life. You see? So you see, the world is all chaos. There's only hope in personal relations, an idea that was also echoed later by E.M. Forster when he said, only connect. Now, as with the rise of Germany as a threat to the British Empire, people began to fear that there would be a big cataclysmic confrontation, and that actually did happen in the First World War. The First World War was, in a sense, more devastating than the Second because it was limited to a small area relatively. It was based entirely on trench warfare. It was a war of attrition. The artillery on both sides just hammered each other, and the casualty rates were much higher than in the Second World War. I mean, if you think of the conflict and the casualty rates, I mean, within small areas, you had thousands and thousands perishing, and an entire generation was decimated. And the victims included a lot of writers and artists. So you know about the poets of the First World War who died, and then those who survived lived on as the lost generation, Hemingway and others. The lost generation signified those who suffered a sense of the sense that they had lost faith in their civilization. And this is the modern wasteland where the traditional values have collapsed, where in the spiritual realm, everything is in shambles. There's no sense of values. There's a sense of drift. We're lost. The only pleasure is hedonism. And the only way you can maintain some dignity is if you have a personal code like the Hemingway Code. Now, all this is directly related to the imperial conflict, the geopolitical conflict between Britain, France, and later on America on the one side, and Germany and Turkey on the other side. So modernism too can be related to geopolitics. In Victorian literature, well, I mean, that is when the empire was at its most confident uh, moment. But even if you look at the literature, you can find how the imperial project is intimately related to the literature and the arts of that era. So Tennyson writing up the charge of the Light Brigade, so cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right of them. You know, theirs is not to question why, theirs is but to do and die. This is the imperial ethos at play. And then we come down to our time. Geopolitics is very much at play. And even as a very humble and obscure post-colonial poet, I could not but register the impact of geopolitics in my own writing. My new collection, The New Frontier, has as its title poem the longest poem I've written, which is 1.33 times the length of Prof. So it's nearly sort of 1.5 times the length of Prof. And this poem arose out of my awareness that global warming is directly related to geopolitics. Not that geopolitics has caused global warming. No, that is something we know. Well, it's all there in the background. That industrial civilization, consumerism, our greed, all these things have played a role. No, but now that global warming has taken place, in the face of global warming, what is going on? We are being told that we should recycle things, and that way we can contribute towards solving the problem. Nothing of the kind. Nothing much will be achieved if you just recycle a few bottles and things. The problem is much bigger. And the poem arose out of an awareness that when there is a crisis, some will suffer and some will benefit from it. As we say in Bangla, Karo Poshmash, Karo Sorbonash, which I translate as it's boom time for some and doom for the rest. Now, we know what's happening in the low-lying parts of the globe. Our coastal areas are also affected. I heard from a friend that NGO workers have found that um, miscarriages are on the rise. Why? Because there's increased salinity, and as there's increased salinity, expectant mothers have high blood pressure, and that leads to miscarriages. So it's it's just a horrifying picture of how these things, such phenomena can affect us in many complex indirect ways, but in terrifying ways. So while all this is going on, while climate change is going on, the social scene is where you have an overpopulated country. You have thugs, political thugs, trying to muscle in on others, and so there are people who get caught up in a squabble and have to run for their lives. And where will they go? They try to emigrate. You see? A lot of these things are also there in a recent novel by Amitav Ghosh, Gun Island, which I heartily recommend to all of you. You can see the geopolitics of the contemporary world over there, the transnationality of crime, of the effects of climate change, etc. So, what I found is that now it struck me that with climate change, the cold countries of the north are going to benefit because they'll warm up, and the places which were frozen will now thaw and they will become cultivable. So Canada has a new northern immigration policy. Then the Arctic is the new frontier. These are actually, I have incorporated these slogans in my poem, and you will find them online. So when I started Googling, I was utterly horrified to see that my suspicions were uh, well founded. So the Arctic is the new frontier. All the rich countries of the north, America, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, Russia, which has the longest Arctic coastline, they are all busy, uh, exploring the Arctic, where the ice is melting, and it has been found that there are tremendous resources, natural resources there, oil, gas, rare minerals, and whatnot. Then with the Arctic thawing, the trade routes will change. So it'll become easier to send ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific along the Arctic route. And Russia is very active there. America is opposed to the Russian activities. While after the Ukraine war started, there was one sentence in a news bulletin one day, which said simply that President Putin has said that the Ukraine war will not stymie the efforts of the Russians to explore the Arctic. Then the Scandinavian countries have websites which say that they are going to exploit the Arctic, but in a sustainable manner. I don't know how they can do that in a sustainable manner when you see the entire region is turning into, or the ice is turning into water. So anyway, so my poem is based on this insight that while we talk about what we have conferences, we have what's that called? There was recently one in Dubai. Before that there was one in Glasgow, and this poem actually emerged out of a project which brought together the University of Swansea in Wales and Dhaka Lit Fest. They commissioned 3 Welsh writers and 3 Bangladeshi writers, one of whom was myself. One was Abir Haq, and Saad, who is also a ULAB Press author. So, and then there were online sessions and other discussions, and then the result is this poem. So I advise you to read it to get an idea about how geopolitics can enter poetry in the contemporary world through the way climate change is playing out. Okay, there's also an essay explaining my discovery of the new frontier. I think I've come to taken up more than the allotted time, right? Jirani?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I'll just end abruptly.
All right. Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful talk. And at this stage, I would like to share some sort of comments and questions. And feel free to share your comments as well as questions.
Ah, Mahdi, on how do sorry, what's the question? Let me see.
Jilan, if you can read the question.
I'm not giving a talk. But
So Rafi has submitted his midterm question. Sir, for
oh,
your moderation, sir.
I see. But that will have to wait until this is over. What is this accenticism?
No, sir, you can address them now as well. These are just, I just suggested some language and linguistics topics. Those could be relevant to this talk.
Question. Okay. Uh, can I? Is this here in the chat?
Jilan, if you can read the question.
Yes, I'm reading.
Thank you.
And what
Chat.
he has
Some
read
potential
the
language and linguistics topics: the geopolitics of gender-neutral pronouns. Yes. Now, this is it's interesting because the geopolitics actually has to do with gender ideology. Okay, I think there are, and even within the Western countries, there is a divide. You see, it's not so really one-sided. So there are many who are opposed to the new gender ideology, and then there are these, all these new pronouns coming up, and civilizational states like Russia and China, I think, are opposed to that, and they sort of, Alexander Dugin has actually published a lot of books on issues like this, and it's very interesting. He's against modernity. It's very amazing. I mean, I mean, he's quite a strange figure, on the contemporary intellectual scene. And but I mean, he is very well read. I mean, from uh, the from Greek, ancient Greek philosophers down to Derrida and even the Yuval Noah Harari and others. So he can comment on it in everything. To him, what he says, I find, you see, I am an individual, right? I'm liberal. To me, what is happening in the world is something that I should try to understand on its own terms and then look at critically. So what Dugin says is that modern Western civilization is opposed to traditional values. A civilization like Russia is traditional. Now, remember, and he sort of relates this to Western individualism. Interestingly, there's another thinker who is not known here much, a French anthropologist, Emmanuel Todd, my age, trained in Cambridge, and from a very distinguished French intellectual family. He at the age of 26 predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. And now he's saying that the Ukraine war is the Third World War, because the Third World War will not be a total clash between the big powers. It'll be a proxy war, and this will continue. Okay. And in his view of, he uses demography and anthropology to argue that, family systems are underlie our values and everything, our social life, etc. That the periphery of the world on the north, the Anglo-Saxon sphere, has the most extreme example of the nuclear family. And this was the original family structure of mankind. In the Eurasian heartland and in Asia, you have, all these extended families, other stem families, all these types. Now, you see, the Anglosphere which is the home of individualism, and it has the perfect nuclear family. And hence you have, this is extended to America. So you think of America expanding westwards. In the American West, what is the picture of the pioneers you have? A man, his wife, his children, their children, both are armed with shotguns. They're going in their carriage westwards, staking a claim to the land. So this Western dynamism, individualism, all this is related. All this is worked out very elaborately. And one example of this in contemporary times was something Margaret Thatcher said. He said, there is no society. There are only individual men and women. So if there's a problem, the individual men and women will have to deal with them. And opposite to that is someone like Alexander Dugin, who says, the individual has no meaning outside society. It is society that gives meaning to the individual. And traditional societies have this, rely on society for giving meaning to life. So his critique is against modernity, Western modernity, against Western individualism. He is upholding traditionalism, etc. And interestingly, I find a parallel between him and a very well-known Indian thinker whom I like very much, Ashish Nandi. After I met him, I said, I tell people that you are my guru. So Ashish Nandi has also critiqued modernity by arguing that traditional societies are, they are sort of condemned by modernity and unfairly, and that traditional societies have evolved ways of dealing with mankind's problems in very interesting ways, which should not be forgotten, etc. Anyway, so the intricacies of this I haven't gone into. Now, what is this? 3 should be Hindi and Urdu. Acha. Rafi asked you a question.
Not a question. So that's not a question. I just suggested few language and linguistics related topic, and that was particularly about language planning, Hindi and Urdu. They basically stem from the same language, Hindustani. But because of the geopolitics, Urdu borrowed more Arabic vocabularies and expressions, and Hindi stick to the Sanskrit ones.
Yeah, actually, I mean, this is directly related to colonial historiography. It's very interesting that before the British came here, the Hindu kings and the Muslim kings, they would fight, but there was no sense of communal conflict, because the Hindu king's armies would have Muslim generals and soldiers. A Muslim king's armies would have Hindu generals and soldiers. Then they shared languages. You had Hindustani. And then when colonial historiography introduced the idea of three phases of Indian history. The Hindu, that is ancient or Hindu, Muslim, and then modern or British. So this thing of Hindu, Muslim, British, this is a colonial creation, because during the so-called Muslim period, the subcontinent was all mixed up. There were Hindu kingdoms, Muslim kingdoms here, Muslim kingdoms fighting against each other, Hindu kingdoms fighting against each other, and all sorts of messy things were going on. So this neat division, this is at the root of the communal consciousness that eventually led to the partition and all the Holocaust of the partition riots, etc. Okay. And the one cultural fallout of this was that a language like the Hindustani, which is a mixed up language, this was split up. So Muslims used, developed Urdu, the Hindus developed Hindi. The same thing happened in Bangla. After the British came here, before the British came here, the Bangla folk literature had, Hindus and Muslims contributing to the tradition, and there were Farsi words, Arabic words in plenty. After the British came here and after the rise of the Hindu upper classes in Calcutta and the so-called Bengal Renaissance, there was a deliberate attempt to get rid of the Persian and Arabic words from Bangla. And it was so ridiculous that even Bankim Chandra said that, well, if a word has become a part of the living language, there's no point in getting rid of it. Okay. But in spite of that, even now, there are the 3,000 Persian and Arabic words in Bangla, not counting the suffixes and prefixes. And as a counter to that, after the partition of 1947, those writers who were imbued with the ideology of Pakistan, they thought that, well, we should try to introduce more Persian and Arabic words in poets like Farooq Ahmed and others. Okay, so this is how the sort of politics affected culture. Okay. Now Muntasir Mamun created him. Oh, Queen Victoria became Emperor of India in 1858, I think. Oh no, in the 1880s actually. In 1858, India became a part of the British Empire. It was directly ruled by the British government, not through the East India Company. But Victoria was installed as the Empress of India, I think sometime in 1874 or 1880, around that time. Her impact on geopolitics. Okay, I mean the British ethos that they were the sort of the sun never sets on the British Empire and all that. That is directly related to the Victorian ethos. Darwin's survival of the fittest is not Darwin's slogan. See, the slogan was given by somebody else, Darwinian, because Darwin was not so stupid. Because survival of the fittest is a circular argument. Survival of the fittest. Who survived the fittest? Who are the fittest? Those who survive. So it's a circular argument. Darwin did not make such a blunder. A Darwinian came up with this idea. Anyway, now Darwinism is something that belongs to biology. Darwinism was then transferred to sociology, and it became social Darwinism. So the argument went like this, that just as you have different kind of species, within the human species you have different races, and there's a hierarchy of races. You see? So you have the whites who are at the top, and then the blacks are at the bottom, and in the middle you have all these different shades. You see? So this is how racism was given a kind of pseudoscientific basis. It has no basis in biology, no basis in science. Okay, but this is part of the colonial ethos. Okay, and it of course affected geopolitics, because it with a philosophy like that, it was easy for people to go slave hunting. Because if you think that these guys are subhuman, they're half animal, you can go and perpetrate all kinds of horrors on them.
Sir, Muntasir here.
Yeah, Muntasir, bolo.
Sir, সোশ্যাল ডারউইনিজম তো স্যার জেন্ডার ইস্যুকেও ইম্প্যাক্ট করেছিল নাকি?
Yeah, certainly.
সেখানেও
তোমার if you think that there's a hierarchy, which has no scientific basis. It's of course.
So I think there are two student questions. Like,
Yeah.
we should not monopolize.
Mehna
Yes.
Barin.
So Ria and Shakil, they have two good questions. So Ria is asking, like, how does world literature, like, influenced by geopolitics? And Shakil is asking, very interestingly, that why are these big fishes interested in Bangladesh?
Of course, there's a geopolitical reason. Ria বলছে যে, yeah, world literature is, I think, it's a direct result of globalization. Okay, because the concept of world literature, it makes one laugh if you think of it. There are 20 universities offering degrees in world literature. Now, how can you do a BA in world literature in 4 years? How much can you study? How many courses? I mean, 120, 130, 140 credits. So you need some GED courses, and then the rest will be literature courses. How many texts of world literature can you deal with? You can't. The concept of world literature has, I think, a positive contribution, which is this: that now, if you take the concept of world literature seriously, you will not feel bound to limit your thinking within national canons. Okay, so you can range freely and create your own sort of personal canon, if you like, which is a good thing. And in fact, the rise of world literature as a discipline, in a sense, captures the way we really read literature. I mean, how do we read literature? We read a review of praising somebody as a very interesting new voice. We buy the book, we read it. If we find it interesting, we buy other books by the same writer. And then we move on to somebody else from another country. See? We are always, our reading is never bound by a narrow national boundary. So today I may be reading a Japanese novel by Murakami. Tomorrow I may be reading a German writer. The day after I may be rereading an old favorite. So you see, the concept of world literature, I think, gives you that freedom. And the geopolitical situation, which is evident in the rise of globalization, is directly related to the rise of world literature. How can literature challenge or reinforce geopolitical stereotypes? No, I think, well, the main thing is that literature has to be critical. It's a criticism of life. And so whether we are facing geopolitics or not, we have to, the imperial narratives of the Middle Kingdom. Now, this is a big question, because the Americans are saying, I mean, those like John Mearsheimer, who think that America's big enemy is China, they are arguing that, well, China, as it rises, will at some point have to expand itself militarily. But those who don't take that idea seriously, like Kishore Mahbubani, the Singapore intellectual, was also a minister and who was an authority on contemporary China. He says that the Chinese ethos is different. You see, at one time, China had a big navy, which came all the way to the Indian Ocean and Sri Lanka. And then the Chinese emperor said that it was wicked to have such a navy because it might go and create trouble in distant lands. So all the ships were sunk. China just destroyed its navy. Okay, so they are interested in overcoming the century of the impact of the century of humiliation, as they call it. And it seems, according to people like Mahbubani and others, that they are primarily interested in economic expansion. But what it will lead to, I don't know, because economic expansion can't go on indefinitely. And if you look at the demography, the birth rate in China is not high. So very soon they'll be short of manpower. Japan is already facing that problem. There are too many old people. It's a geriatric society. So the economic growth is affected. There was another question. Why are all the big guns interested in Bangladesh? The big guns are interested in every country. Now, Bangladesh is located next door to Myanmar and with India on the other side and China not far away. So, you see, you have geopolitical games going on. I don't know sort of what exactly is going on, but America would like to have Bangladesh on its side. China would, it seems, from what the Chinese ambassador said, China wants Bangladesh to remain without free of American direct American influence. Russia has sided with China. India has its own interest in Bangladesh. So, as Mayor Scheimer said, a small country has to suck up to big powers.
All right. So if you have any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and share your questions.
Oh, there's another one. How does world literature also influence geopolitics? Literature does not influence geopolitics. I mean, literature does not influence, doesn't have much influence, really. I mean, writers try to boost their ego by saying, literature can do things. We can make a change in the world. There's very little that literature can do. I think the airing of critical views is enough for literature. There's little direct impact of literature on geopolitics. Except, I suppose, when literature becomes an organ of propaganda, you see. So in the First World War, interestingly, Shakespeare was weaponized, you see. So the British said, the British viewpoint was that we are fighting for our civilization, we are fighting to preserve Shakespeare. And at that time, some passages of Shakespeare, remember the one in Richard II, this sceptred isle, this blessed land, etc., etc., in a very patriotic passage. It's one of the characters saying it. So that kind of thing would be widely quoted and recited and anthologized. So Shakespeare was used as an icon of British civilization, and the Hun was demonized. The way the Germans were demonized is quite extraordinary. Okay, anything else?
We got one question from Mahdi Hassan, our faculty member. How do geopolitical power dynamics influence funding, collaboration, and knowledge production within academic communities across?
Yeah.
Jilani, I think that question may be out of the scope of this.
No.
But
if you're applying for a grant, and if you can impress upon those who award the grant that your views are in harmony with the views of the country that's giving the grant, then you stand a better chance. You see, now to give you an example, not of a grant being given, but a grant being refused. Somebody had applied for a Fulbright, and he wanted to do research on Eliot. The application was turned down because the USAS people here looking after Fulbright, they said that Eliot is not an American poet. He became a British citizen, so we can't do that. But if you're doing it on an American poet, Whitman or Emily Dickinson, that would be fine. So grants are affected by questions of geopolitics or political national identity, etc. Nafur, yes, by ancient beliefs. You mean the geopolitical strategies of the colonizers in British India?
Yes, sir.
Well, interestingly, the British Orientalists played a very positive role in making us aware of our cultural heritage, both Persian and Sanskrit. You see. So the Orientalist scholars were not only propagandists for empire, they were also serious scholars who studied the Indian texts, and wrote commentaries. They set up the Asiatic Society of Bengal. They published journals, published books and studies. And I think in historiography they played a very nasty role by creating this divide between Hindu period, Muslim period, and British period. So this affected the mind. Then they had all kinds of strange influences. In the 1857 uprising, the so-called Sipahi Bidroho, those who rebelled most of them were recruits from the Gangetic Plain, see? Including Bengal, Bihar, UP, all the way to the Punjab. And after the mutiny, the British realized that the Sikhs, Punjabis, and others, the Dogras, they had remained loyal to them. But those from the Gangetic Plain had betrayed them, had become revolutionaries. There was a guy from Shondip. He was a Havildar. You find it online if you Google this. This guy led a company in rebellion against the British. From Chittagong, he moved his company northwards. He was fighting the British as he moved all the way to Sylhet. The rebels killed a British major. Eventually, of course, he lost and he was killed in battle. You can find his name. I forget his name, but a guy from Shundi. Now, after the mutiny was over, the British then decided that they would recruit soldiers only from the groups of people that had remained loyal, the nations that had remained loyal to the Sikhs and the Punjabis and Dogras and others. Those people were labeled as martial races, and we were labeled as non-martial races. So the British Indian Army was recruited mainly from the so-called martial races. Okay. And this created a certain mindset. Those who were recruited in the British Indian Army from those, provinces, they thought that they were superior. And Kipling and others, they sort of fomented this psychology that the Bengali Babu is effete, weak. He may be smart, but the Pathan and the Sikh and the Dogra, they're the ones, they're real men. In the famous poem, East is East and West is West, and ne'er the twain shall meet. After that comes the lines which say that it's only when two strong men face each other that there is neither East nor West. So if you are strong, you can transcend the contradiction of East and West. But however, Kipling is a very complex writer also. So even though he makes fun of the Bengali Babu, in Kim, one of the master spies working for the British is a Bengali. He's not physically impressive, but he has his he is brilliant as a spy master. You see? So, does that answer your question? See? The British then created this divide, and that affected relations between West Pakistan and East Pakistan. You see that when the Punjabis is all this about Bengal, the weak and all that, this idea was implanted in them by the British. Because if you look at history, there were Bengalis fighting the British in the 19th century. In the so-called, there was a war against the British launched in the frontier province, a jihad against the British. And there were Bengali Muslims from here who sneaked all across the subcontinent and joined the fighting. The British were surprised to see among the big strapping Pathans who were fighting them, some small diminutive dark fellows also, who were also fighting with great courage. So they were puzzled. Where have these guys come from? Then a policeman in the Punjab caught one of these guys who was being taken to the frontier to fight. So he was interrogated, and it came out that this guy was a Bengali peasant, you see, who was going to join the jihad against the British. So it's not that the people, that the Bengalis could not fight, but they created this colonial stereotype of the martial races and the non-martial races. Okay. And that affected relations between East Bengal and Pakistan. And in 71 it became clear that, and 71 therefore had a very positive role in giving us, in restoring to us the confidence that we could fight. You see, so our awareness, you see, our national awareness as a people who can stand up for themselves and resist, this emerged out of the sort of through the baptism of fire, that is 1971.
Sir, we got another question. This is from Shamsad sir. Were the Romantic writers compelled to code and symbolize the geopolitical realities of the French Revolution?
Oh,
So this will be the last question.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this is something that I'm sure there are many studies of this, and the impact of the French Revolution on British Romanticism. So and also on the.
Sir, if I may, sir, supplement, so the only place where Wordsworth mentions French Revolution is in the prelude, and he calls it "A gentle breeze caressed my cheek." And so there was this fear, like Arab Spring, that the French Revolution would cross the English Channel.
Exactly.
So I was hoping that you'd reflect on that kind of reality in which writers are often forced to, so use symbols, the characters plot, like for example Afghanistan in Kite Runner. So the setting itself, speaks of a geopolitical reality. So Life of Pi. So the tiger becomes, one of the elements of cultural identity and the fragmentation because of geopolitical reality and so forth.
Yeah, in the case of the French Revolution, I think what happened is that, number one, it was it aroused enthusiasm in some of the romantics, and then that enthusiasm was dampened by
died down. Yeah.
So that has a very interesting and complex history of how the response to the French Revolution.
All right. This brings us almost at the end of our session. And Shamshid sir, do you want to add any more comments?
No, this was superb. Like, so I'm blown away. So thank you so much, sir. And I'm going to read New Frontier now.
All right. So at this stage, I'd like to request our head of the department.
And students, please buy the book.
Yeah, it's
So I sent
offered
an email.
at a great discount. Oliur, bolo.
Let's wrap up, right, Arifa, maybe.
Yeah, let's wrap up. It's quite late and sir must be tired. So, Oliver, maybe you can ask your question in the campus.
I'm sorry, it was actually a mistake.
All right, no problem. Thank you, Jilani, and thank you so much, Kaiser sir, for that really wonderful, all-encompassing sort of discussion and with relevance to our courses that are being taught right now. So thank you so much for doing that, sir. And I hope the students have learned about the concept and how they might be able to, I'm sure their brains are churning now with ideas about how to implement this through their projects that will be showcased at the end of the term. So for now, let's wrap up, and you guys can go ahead and study for your midterms, which are coming up next week. But after that, the faculty members and the students of the participating courses can start planning their projects, and we will have a physical showcase on campus at the end of the term. So no more recorded videos and stuff like that, but we want presentations and posters and anything that you can demonstrate your understanding of this concept in relation to your courses that will be exhibited on campus. So looking forward to seeing those creative ideas. And thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you, Jilani, and thank you, Kaiser sir, once again. Thank you, Shamshid sir, for being here.
Thank you very much. I mean, I didn't realize that I had overstepped the time limit by such a long time. By so many minutes. But anyway, enjoy your dinner, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir and ma'am.